Behind her 2 fighting armies, before her a burning bridge, a baby in her arms. This is just the particular story of my family that I like to be able to tell, and I want people to remember it. And I don't know if it's going to be there after I'm gone, so it seems like a nice idea to tell it.
When my grandmother married, she brought to the marriage the Civil War stories of what her family went through. She was born after the Civil War, and so was her husband. And interestingly, they both had such very different Civil War stories from each of their families. So the things that happened on Katie's farm before the Civil War, the family was just an ordinary farming family, growing wheat grain like nearly all the farms did here. So people were working really hard, and they realized that there was a lot of talk about possibly a war because slavery was the big issue. Mennonites basically believed that Jesus said, "Do unto others as you would want them to do to you." You don't want somebody else to make you a slave, so Mennonites did not ever hold slaves. There was so much dissension about the way forward in our country, so it was time for a vote in the state of Virginia, and the vote was on whether to secede and be part of the Confederacy. It's hard for us to imagine how much controversy there was, and hostility and fear and all kinds of things about this vote. And you had to give your vote out loud in front of your neighbors, including in front of people who were very angry, people who had threatened other people and really were watching to see how you were going to vote. There was a man who had been brought back forcibly and forced to change his vote. There was another family where he was threatened by neighbors or acquaintances who came to his farm and told him, "You'd better go down and vote yes, or you will be hung." This really scared him, so on the day of the vote, he went down and voted yes for secession. And his wife said later that he regretted that all the rest of his life. Jacob apparently told other people that he was going to go down and vote. When he entered and was asked, "Jacob Wenger, how do you vote?" he said, "I vote no." And then he asked for a notarized statement of his vote. And they gave him a statement that said, in essence, Jacob Wenger voted no. As an attorney, I'm thinking he was thinking like a lawyer. He was making a record. He was going to put himself in a position where he could show something that he needed to prove. Only 11 other people in his whole precinct actually voted no like he did, so it was a pretty overwhelming vote in favor of secession. So the war came, and there were soldiers all through the valley here who, of course, not being at home, not having their own kitchens, were able to just go into anybody's house, onto anybody's farm, and take food. And in fact, there was a family that Katie's family knew that had just baked bread. Soldiers came to the house to take food, and they could smell the bread that had just been baked. They searched the whole house. They just turned it upside down, and they just couldn't find it, and finally gave up. And you think the soldiers are there, and they're hungry, and they know there's bread there. I'm guessing that the family just sat there and didn't say anything to them. And the bread, in fact, had been put underneath the baby in the cradle. At Katie's house, which was a big brick house built in 1854, there was actually what was called an English basement, which meant that the basement had windows which were a bit high. So that meant that the house itself was up a bit higher than a house would ordinarily be. What Katie's family did was to take their furniture out of the living room, shut the door. In the hallway, where the door opened, they put a big dresser in front of the door. And then they went around through the back window to this living room and poured their grain into this big empty room. All the grain they had was stored in that one place. So when soldiers came to Katie's farm, they, came in the front of the house, and they came into the hallway, and there was a big dresser. So they walked past the dresser, unaware that behind it was a closed door, behind which was a whole room full of grain. They never found the grain in Katie's farmhouse. So the family could take grain all throughout the war and take it down the road from their farm to the mill. And it was an old grist mill. My mother only told me this story once, and I was very young. So I just remember a sort of fear in her voice. One day, a soldier came over to near the house and came up to one of the older children who was holding the baby and said, "Give me the baby." So the child handed the baby to the soldier, and he took it back to where the other soldiers were and handed it to one of them, who handed it to another and another and another. So they passed the child around, and at some point, Katie's mother came on the scene and saw what was happening. So at that point, the first soldier brought the baby back over to her and handed it to her and said, "We wanted to hold your baby because we miss our children." If you're growing up here in the Shenandoah Valley, like I was, you're going to hear a lot about the Civil War. You might think, wow, Civil War is really exciting. You've got battlefields and battles and strategy and weapons and cannons. Hopefully they come to realize that in fact what really happened was that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people were killed. People lost their husbands and their fathers and their sons, their cousins, their brothers, their uncles. The enslaving of people and the war over slavery is really the saddest thing that ever happened in our country. Near the end of the war, there was a real push that was called the burning. Soldiers from the north who came down specifically to the Shenandoah Valley over a 2-day period just did a blitz where they raced from one farm to the other to burn down any barn, any shed that had any food in it. So the whole idea was to just wipe out the food supply that was supporting the Southern Army down here to end the war. It was, of course, really scary for everyone. And the soldiers came to Katie's farm 3 different times during the 2 days. And as they came in the lane, Jacob Wenger, her father, walked out to meet them and showed them the statement, the paper that he had from when he had voted. One of the times a soldier patted him on the back. All 3 of the times they read this piece of paper and decided not to burn down his barn. It's kind of a remarkable relic that is still on the farm that is, for us, a reminder that our great-grandfather, stood up for what he believed. The soldiers on horseback also went racing around and came up to the mill. And Mrs. Shaver, who lived there, was a Brethren woman, and the Brethren believed, like the Mennonites, that you should do good to someone who's going to harm you. So when the soldiers came up to the mill, Mrs. Shaver walked out to meet them and offered them her pies. And then they said to her, "We're sorry. We were ordered to burn down your barn, but we'll light it and we'll leave." Mrs. Shaver was there. There was a broom. She was trying to beat out the fire, but she was 80 years old and her husband was sick in bed. So possibly they thought they were giving her a chance because they figured there are 2 people here on the farm, and there weren't. So she rang the dinner gong really loud, and Jacob Wenger, Katie's father, was up on the hill with other people looking out and watching all these fires. So they heard the dinner gong and came racing down over the hill, and the barn was too far gone. So it actually is not here anymore, but they were able to save the mill. Susanna was a young woman who was orphaned in her teenage years. In 1859, she married Henry Brunk. Shortly after that, the Civil War broke out. Their story is one in which they ended up leaving the valley during the Civil War.
In the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, in 1859, my great-grandmother, Susanna Heatwole, courted and married Henry Brunk. They had a son. Not long thereafter, the Civil War broke out. Henry and Susanna believed to kill someone in war or peace was contrary to the teachings of Jesus, who taught his followers to love even their enemies. They knew he could not be a soldier. So he and 69 other young men, Dunkers and Mennonites, rode out of the war zone hoping to escape. They were captured by Confederate soldiers who demanded they surrender their arms. As he joked later, "We surrendered our Bibles." The soldiers took their horses and put the men in prison. They gave them 3 choices. 1, put on uniforms and take up arms. 2, haul supplies as a non-combatant. Or 3, stay in prison. He had a wife and a baby son. He decided to haul supplies as a non-combatant. But Henry's conscience still bothered him. He knew he was still part of the machinery for killing men. One day, he simply left his team of horses and supplies in the field and walked off through the orchard and the woods, a deserter with a price on his head. He hid in the attics of friends and neighbors, weaving willow baskets to earn money, while Susanna, pregnant, cared for their son John at home. One day, she gave birth to a daughter, Sarah. Not long thereafter, their son John died. Henry heard the news. He knew Confederate scouts would be at that funeral to track him down. So he stood in the back like a stranger with his hat pulled down and left before the last hymn was sung, and Susanna stood alone at their son's grave. Then Henry and 16 other young Mennonite men managed to escape to the north. Henry sent a message to Susanna, "Meet me in Hagerstown." She loaded her spring wagon with her possessions and set off with her baby and her sister. They rode northward into war territory. Suddenly they were surrounded by Confederates who seized Susanna's horse. As they were unhitching, she kept clinging to the bridle. "Please leave your hands off my horse." Someone shouted, "Yanks! The Yanks are coming! Come with us!" "I'll do no such thing." The soldiers left her horse to flee the Union Army, so she rode on northward. She was almost at Hagerstown. She had only to cross the Potomac River. She reached Harper's Ferry. The bridge was burning. Behind her, 2 fighting armies. Before her, a burning bridge, a baby in her arms. A miller appeared. He showed her a place where others had managed to cross. She plunged her spring wagon into the Potomac River and crossed safely. She arrived in Hagerstown. She rode down the street. She looked from left to right. She glanced in a storefront at a shoemaker repairing shoes. Henry looked up. Their eyes met. As they understood the story, it was the horse who recognized Henry and stopped. The story doesn't end there. They moved to Illinois, like many others, and had 5 more children in the next 8 years. Then, like many others, they decided to move west to Kansas in a covered wagon. Though the Civil War had long ended, the feelings of resentment were still very strong between the North and the South. Missouri was a slave state, Kansas a free state. The Missourians refused to let settlers on their way to the free state of Kansas drink water from their wells. So Susanna, pregnant, Henry, and their 6 children drank from the streams and the ponds. When they arrived in Kansas, Henry unhitched the horses, made a rough wood shelter made of boards, and lay down. He never got up again. He died of typhoid fever. He was 37 years old. In the next 6 months, Susanna gave birth, and 3 of her 7 children died of typhoid fever. My grandfather remembers something from his childhood there. He's 5 years old, standing in his mother's skirts as she's leaning over the big kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, cutting up her husband's clothes to make clothing for the children. Her 10-year-old son took work in a cane mill. Then, in the middle of the night, men came knocking at the door. "Your son has been hurt. He fell asleep. His arm got caught in the iron roller." They brought him in and laid him on that same kitchen table and cut off his arm. In later years, she told all these stories to her grandchildren. They remember many Christmas and Thanksgiving dinners in her prairie home. They remember the little cakes she sent home with them after dinner. And though they couldn't remember her ever singing before, when the end came, she sang. She asked the family to sing, she asked the doctor to sing, and they all sang her favorite song. "Oh, happy day that fixed my choice on thee, my Savior and my God."
Well, may this glowing heart rejoice and tell its raptures all abroad. Happy day, when Jesus washed my sins away. He taught me how to watch and pray, and live rejoicing every day. Happy day, when when Jesus washed my sins away.